Part One of Chapter 8 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bologna Times. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part 1, Chapter 8. Those of us whom business or curiosity took to Sulaco in these years before the first advent of the railway can remember the steadying effect of the San Tome mine upon the life of that remote province. The outward appearances had not changed then as they have changed since, as I am told, with cable cars running along the streets of the Constitution, and carriage roads far into the country, to Rincon and other villages, where the foreign merchants and the ricos generally have their modern villas, and a vast railway goods yard by the harbour, which has a quayside, a long range of warehouses, and quite serious organized labour troubles of its own. Nobody had ever heard of labour troubles then. The cargadores of the port formed, indeed, an unruly brotherhood of all sorts of scum, with a patron saint of their own. They went on strike regularly, every bullfight day, a form of trouble that even Nostromo at the height of his prestige could never cope with efficiently. But the morning after each fiesta, before the Indian market women had opened their mat parasols on the plaza, when the snows of Higuerota gleamed pale over the town on a yet black sky, the appearance of a phantom-like horseman mounted on a silver-grey mare solved the problem of labour without fail. His steed paced the lanes of the slums and the weed-grown enclosures within the old ramparts, between the black, lightless cluster of huts, like cow byres, like dog kennels. The horseman hammered with the butt of a heavy revolver at the doors of low pulperias, of obscene lean-to sheds sloping against the tumble-down piece of a noble wall, at the wooden sides of dwellings so flimsy that the sound of snores and sleepy mutters within could be heard in the pauses of the thundering clatter of his blows. He called out men's names menacingly from the saddle, once, twice. The drowsy answers, grumpy, conciliating, savage, jocular, or deprecating, came out into the silent darkness in which the horseman sat still, and presently a dark figure would flit out coughing in the still air. Sometimes a low-toned woman cried through the window-hole softly, "He's coming directly, Signor," and the horseman waited silent on a motionless horse. But if perchance he had to dismount, then, after a while, from the door of that hovel or of that pulperia, with a ferocious scuffle and stifled imprecations, a cargador would fly out, head first and hands abroad, to sprawl under the forelegs of the silver-grey mare, who only pricked forward her sharp little ears. She was used to that work, and the man, picking himself up, would walk away hastily from Nostromo's revolver, reeling a little along the street and snarling low curses. At sunrise, Captain Mitchell, coming out anxiously in his night attire on to the wooden balcony running the whole length of the O.S.N. Company's lonely building by the shore, would see the lighters already under way, figures moving busily about the cargo cranes, perhaps hear the invaluable Nostromo, now dismounted and in the checked shirt and red sash of a Mediterranean sailor, bawling orders from the end of the jetty in a stentorian voice. A fellow in 1,000. The material apparatus of perfected civilization which obliterates the individuality of old towns under the stereotyped conveniences of modern life had not intruded as yet, but over the worn-out antiquity of Sulaco, so characteristic with its stuccoed houses and barred windows, with the great yellowy white walls of abandoned convents behind the rows of sombre green cypresses, that fact, very modern in its spirit, the San Tome mine had already thrown its subtle influence. It had altered, too, the outward character of the crowds on feast days on the plaza before the open portal of the cathedral, by the number of white ponchos with a green stripe affected as holiday wear by the San Tome miners. They had also adopted white hats with green cord and braid, articles of good quality, which could be obtained in the storehouses of the administration for very little money. A peaceable cholo wearing these colors, unusual in Costaguana, was somehow very seldom beaten to within an inch of his life on a charge of disrespect to the town police. Neither ran he much risk of being suddenly lassoed on the road by a recruiting party of lanceros, a method of voluntary enlistment looked upon as almost legal in the Republic. Whole villages were known to have volunteered for the army in that way, but, as Don Pepe would say, with a hopeless shrug to Mrs. Gould, "What would you? Poor people. Pobrecitos, pobrecitos. But the state must have its soldiers." Thus professionally spoke Don Pepe the fighter, with pendant moustaches, a nut brown lean face, and a clean run of a cast iron jaw, suggesting the type of cattle herd horseman from the great llanos of the south. "If you will listen to an old officer of Paez, senores," was the exordium of all his speeches in the aristocratic club of Sulaco, where he was admitted on account of his past services to the extinct cause of federation. The club, dating from the days of the proclamation of Costaguana's independence, boasted many names of liberators amongst its first founders. Suppressed arbitrarily innumerable times by various governments, with memories of proscriptions, and of at least one wholesale massacre of its members, sadly assembled for a banquet by the order of a zealous military commandante, their bodies were afterwards stripped naked and flung into the plaza out of the windows by the lowest scum of the populace. It was again flourishing, at that period, peacefully. It extended to strangers the large hospitality of the cool, big rooms of its historic quarters in the front of a house, once the residence of a high official of the Holy Office. The two wings, shut up, crumbled behind the nailed doors, and what may be described as a grove of young orange trees grown in the unpaved patio concealed the utter ruin of the back part facing the gate. You turned in from the street, as if entering a secluded orchard, where you came upon the foot of a disjointed staircase, guarded by a moss-stained effigy of some saintly bishop, mitred and staffed, and bearing the indignity of a broken nose meekly, with his fine stone hands crossed on his breast. The chocolate-colored faces of servants with mops of black hair peeped at you from above. The click of billiard balls came to your ears, and, ascending the steps, you would perhaps see in the first sala, very stiff upon a straight-backed chair, in a good light, Don Pepe moving his long moustaches as he spelt his way at arm's length through an old Santa Marta newspaper. His horse, a stony-hearted but persevering black brute with a hammer head, you would have seen in the street dozing motionless under an immense saddle, with its nose almost touching the curbstone of the sidewalk. Don Pepe, when "down from the mountain," as the phrase, often heard in Sulaco, went, could also be seen in the drawing-room of the Casa Gould. He sat with modest assurance at some distance from the tea-table. With his knees close together, and a kindly twinkle of drollery in his deep-set eyes, he would throw his small and ironic pleasantries into the current of conversation. There was in that man a sort of sane, humorous shrewdness, and a vein of genuine humanity so often found in simple old soldiers of proved courage, who had seen much desperate service. Of course he knew nothing whatever of mining, but his employment was of a special kind. He was in charge of the whole population in the territory of the mine, which extended from the head of the gorge to where the cart track from the foot of the mountain enters the plain, crossing a stream over a little wooden bridge painted green. Green, the color of hope, being also the color of the mine. It was reported in Sulaco that up there, at the mountain, Don Pepe walked about precipitous paths, girt with a great sword and in a shabby uniform with tarnished bullion epaulettes of a senior major. Most miners, being Indians, with big wild eyes, addressed him as Taita, father, as these barefooted people of Costaguana will address anyone who wears shoes. But it was Basilio, Mr. Gould's own mozo and the head servant of the casa, who, in all good faith and from a sense of propriety, announced him once in the solemn words, "El Señor Gobernador has arrived." Don Jose Avellanos, then in the drawing room, was delighted beyond measure at the aptness of the title, with which he greeted the old major banteringly as soon as the latter's soldierly figure appeared in the doorway. Don Pepe only smiled in his long moustaches, as much as to say, "You might have found a worse name for an old soldier." And El Señor Gobernador he had remained, with his small jokes upon his function and upon his domain, where he affirmed with humorous exaggeration to Mrs. Gould, "No two stones could come together anywhere without Gobernador hearing the click, Senora." And he would tap his ear with the tip of his forefinger knowingly. Even when the number of the miners alone rose to over 600, he seemed to know each of them individually, all the innumerable Joses, Manuels, Ignacios from the villages Primero, Segundo, or Tercero. There were 3 mining villages under his government. He could distinguish them not only by their flat, joyless faces, which to Mrs. Gould looked all alike, as if run into the same ancestral mold of suffering and patience, but apparently also by the infinitely graduated shades of reddish brown, of blackish brown, of coppery brown backs, as the 2 shifts, stripped to linen drawers and leather skull caps, mingled together with a confusion of naked limbs, of shouldered picks, swinging lamps, and a great shuffle of sandaled feet on the open plateau before the entrance of the main tunnel. It was a time of pause. The Indian boys leaned idly against the long line of little cradle wagons standing empty. The screeners and oar breakers squatted on their heels smoking long cigars. The great wooden chutes, slanting over the edge of the tunnel plateau, were silent, and only the ceaseless, violent rush of water in the open flumes could be heard, murmuring fiercely with the splash and rumble of revolving turbine wheels, and the thudding march of the stamps pounding to powder the treasure rock on the plateau below. The heads of gangs, distinguished by brass medals hanging on their bare breasts, marshaled their squads, and at last the mountain would swallow one half of the silent crowd, while the other half would move off in long files down the zigzag paths leading to the bottom of the gorge. It was deep, and far below, a thread of vegetation winding between the blazing rock faces resembled a slender green cord, in which 3 lumpy knots of banana patches, palm leaf roots, and shady trees marked the village 1, village 2, village 3, housing the miners of the gold concession. Whole families had been moving from the first towards the spot in the Higuerota range, whence the rumor of work and safety had spread over the pastoral campo, forcing its way also, even as the waters of a high flood, into the nooks and crannies of the distant blue walls of the Sierras. Father first, in a pointed straw hat, then the mother with the bigger children, generally also a diminutive donkey, all under burdens, except the leader himself, or perhaps some grown girl, the pride of the family, stepping barefooted and straight as an arrow, with braids of raven hair, a thick, haughty profile, and no load to carry but the small guitar of the country and a pair of soft leather sandals tied together on her back. At the sight of such parties strung out on the cross trails between the pastures, or camped by the side of the royal road, travelers on horseback would remark to each other, "More people going to the San Tome mine. We shall see others tomorrow." And spurring on in the dusk they would discuss the great news of the province, the news of the San Tome mine. A rich Englishman was going to work it, and perhaps not an Englishman. Quien sabe? A foreigner with much money. Oh yes, it had begun. A party of men who had been to Sulaco with a herd of black bulls for the next corrida had reported that from the porch of the posada in Rincon, only a short league from the town, the lights on the mountain were visible, twinkling above the trees. And there was a woman seen riding a horse sideways, not in the chair seat, but upon a sort of saddle, and a man's hat on her head. She walked about, too, on foot, up the mountain paths. A woman engineer, it seemed she was. "What an absurdity! Impossible, signor!" Si, uno Americani del Norte." "Ah, well, if your worship is informed, una Americana, it need be something of that sort." And they would laugh a little with astonishment and scorn, keeping a wary eye on the shadows of the road, for one is liable to meet bad men when travelling late on the Campo. And it was not only the men that Don Pepe knew so well, but he seemed able, with one attentive, thoughtful glance, to classify each woman, girl, or growing youth of his domain. It was only the small fry that puzzled him sometimes. He and the padre could be seen frequently side by side, meditative, and gazing across the street of a village at a lot of sedate brown children, trying to sort them out, as it were, in low, consulting tones. Or else they would together put searching questions as to the parentage of some small, staid urchin met wandering, naked and grave, along the road, with a cigar in his baby mouth, and perhaps his mother's rosary, purloined for purposes of ornamentation, hanging in a loop of beads low down on his rotund little stomach. The spiritual and temporal pastors of the mine flock were very good friends. With Dr. Monygham, the medical pastor, who had accepted the charge from Mrs. Gould and lived in the hospital building, they were on not so intimate terms. But no one could be on intimate terms with El Señor Doctor, who, with his twisted shoulders, drooping head, sardonic mouth, and sidelong bitter glance, was mysterious and uncanny. The other two authorities worked in harmony. Father Roman, dried up, small, alert, wrinkled, with big round eyes, a sharp chin, and a great snuff-taker, was an old campaigner too. He had shriven many simple souls on the battlefields of the Republic, kneeling by the dying on hillsides, in the long grass, in the gloom of the forests, to hear the last confession with the smell of gunpowder smoke in his nostrils, the rattle of muskets, the hum and spatter of bullets in his ears. And where was the harm if, at the presbytery, they had a game with a pack of greasy cards in the early evening, before Don Pepe went his last rounds to see that all the watchmen of the mine, a body organized by himself, were at their posts? For that last duty before he slept, Don Pepe did actually gird his old sword on the veranda of an unmistakable American white frame house, which Father Roman called the presbytery. Near by, a long, low, dark building, steeple-roofed, like a vast barn with a wooden cross over the gable, was the miners' chapel. There Father Roman said mass every day before a sombre altar-piece representing the resurrection. The gray slab of the tombstone balanced on one corner a figure soaring upwards, long-limbed and livid in an oval of pallid light, and a helmeted brown legionary smitten down, right across the bituminous foreground. This picture, my children, muy linda y maravillosa, Father Roman would say to some of his flock, which you behold here through the munificence of the wife of our Señor Administrator, has been painted in Europe, a country of saints and miracles, and much greater than our Costaguana, and he would take a pinch of snuff with unction. But when once an inquisitive spirit desired to know in what direction this Europe was situated, whether up or down the coast, Father Roman, to conceal his perplexity, became very reserved and severe. No doubt it is extremely far away, but ignorant sinners like you of the San Tome mine should think earnestly of everlasting punishment, instead of inquiring into the magnitude of the earth, with its countries and populations altogether beyond your understanding. With a "Good night, padre," "Good night, Don Pepe," the gobernador would go off, holding up his sabre against his side, his body bent forward, with a long plodding stride in the dark. The jocularity proper to an innocent card game for a few cigars or a bundle of yerba was replaced at once by the stern duty mood of an officer setting out to visit the outposts of an encamped army. One loud blast of the whistle that hung from his neck provoked instantly a great shrilling of responding whistles, mingled with the barking of dogs, that would calm down slowly at last, away up at the head of the gorge. And in the stillness two serenos on guard by the bridge would appear walking noiselessly towards him. On one side of the road a long frame building, the store, would be closed and barricaded from end to end. Facing it, another white frame house, still longer, and with a veranda, the hospital, would have lights in the two rooms of Dr. Monygham's quarters. Even the delicate foliage of a clump of pepper trees did not stir, so breathless would be the darkness warmed by the radiation of the overheated rocks. Don Pepe would stand still for a moment with the two motionless serenos before him, and abruptly, high up on the sheer face of the mountain, dotted with single torches, like drops of fire fallen from the two great blazing clusters of lights above, the ore chutes would begin to rattle. The great clattering, shuffling noise, gathering speed and weight, would be caught up by the walls of the gorge, and sent upon the plain in a growl of thunder. The pasadero and Rincon swore that on calm nights, by listening intently, he could catch the sound in his doorway as of a storm in the mountains. End of Part 1, Chapter 8. Part 2, Chapter 8 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Bologna Times. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part 2 of Chapter 8. To Charles Gould's fancy it seemed that the sound must reach the uttermost limits of the province. Riding at night towards the mine, it would meet him at the edge of a little wood just beyond Rincon. There was no mistaking the growing mutter of the mountain pouring its stream of treasure under the stamps, and it came to his heart with the peculiar force of a proclamation thundered forth over the land and the marvellousness of an accomplished fact fulfilling an audacious desire. He had heard this very sound in his imagination on that far-off evening when his wife and himself, after a tortuous ride through a strip of forest, had reined in their horses near the stream, and had gazed for the first time upon the jungle-grown solitude of the gorge. The head of a palm rose here and there. In a high ravine round the corner of the San Tome mountain, which is square like a blockhouse, the thread of a slender waterfall flashed bright and glassy through the dark green of the heavy fronds of tree ferns. Don Pepe, in attendance, rode up, and stretching his arm up the gorge, had declared with mock solemnity, "Behold the very paradise of snakes, Senora." And then they had wheeled their horses and ridden back to sleep that night at Rincon. The alcalde, an old, skinny Moreno, a sergeant of Guzman Bento's time, had cleared respectfully out of his house with his three pretty daughters, to make room for the foreign senora and their worships the caballeros. All he asked Charles Gould, whom he took for a mysterious and official person, to do for him was to remind the supreme government, el gobierno supreme, of a pension amounting to about $1 a month, to which he believed himself entitled. It had been promised to him, he affirmed, straightening his bent back martially, many years ago for my valor in the wars with the wild Indios when a young man, senor. The waterfall existed no longer. The tree ferns that had luxuriated in its spray had died around the dried up pool, and the high ravine was only a big trench half filled up with the refuse of excavations and tailings. The torrent, dammed up above, sent its water rushing along the open flumes of scooped tree trunks, striding on trestle legs to the turbines working the stamps on the lower plateau, the Mesa Grande of the San Tome mountain. Only the memory of the waterfall with its amazing fernery, like a hanging garden above the rocks of the gorge, was preserved in Mrs. Gould's watercolor sketch. She had made it hastily one day from a cleared patch in the bushes, sitting in the shade of a roof of straw erected for her on 3 rough poles under Don Pepe's direction. Mrs. Gould had seen it all from the beginning. The clearing of the wilderness, the making of the road, the cutting of new paths up the cliff face of San Tome. For weeks together she had lived on the spot with her husband, and she was so little in Sulaco during that year that the appearance of the Gould carriage on the Alameda would cause a social excitement. From the heavy family coaches full of stately senoras and black-eyed senoritas rolling solemnly in the shaded alley, white hands were waved towards her with animation and a flutter of greetings. Dona Emilia was down from the mountain. But not for long. Dona Emilia would be gone up the mountain in a day or two, and her sleek carriage mules would have an easy time of it for another long spell. She had watched the erection of the first frame house put up on the lower mesa for an office and Don Pepe's quarters. She heard with a thrill of thankful emotion the first wagon load of ore rattle down the then only chute. She had stood by her husband's side, perfectly silent, and gone cold all over with excitement at the instant when the first battery of only 15 stamps was put in motion for the first time. On the occasion when the fires under the first set of retorts in their shed had glowed far into the night, she did not retire to rest on the rough cadre set up for her in the as yet bare frame house, till she had seen the first spongy lump of silver yielded to the hazards of the world by the dark depths of the Gould concession. She had laid her unmercenary hands with an eagerness that made them tremble upon the first silver ingot turned out still warm from the mold, and by her imaginative estimate of its power she endowed that lump of metal with a justificative conception, as though it were not a mere fact, but something far-reaching and impalpable, like the true expression of an emotion or the emergence of a principle. Don Pepe, extremely interested too, looked over her shoulder with a smile that, making longitudinal folds on his face, caused it to resemble a leathern mask with a benignantly diabolic expression. "Would not the muchachos of Hernandez like to get hold of this insignificant object that looks, por Dios, very much like a piece of tin?" he remarked jocularly. Hernandez the robber had been an inoffensive small ranchero, kidnapped with circumstances of peculiar atrocity from his home during one of the civil wars, and forced to serve in the army. There his conduct as soldier was exemplary, till, watching his chance, he killed his colonel, and managed to get clear away. With a band of deserters who chose him for their chief, he had taken refuge beyond the wild and waterless Bolson de Tonoro. The haciendas paid him blackmail in cattle and horses. Extraordinary stories were told of his powers and of his wonderful escapes from capture. He used to ride, single-handed, into the villages and the little towns on the Campo, driving a pack mule before him, with 2 revolvers in his belt, go straight to the shop or store, select what he wanted, and ride away unopposed because of the terror his exploits and his audacity inspired. Poor country people he usually left alone. The upper class were often stopped on the roads and robbed, but any unlucky official that fell into his hands was sure to get a severe flogging. The army officers did not like his name to be mentioned in their presence. His followers, mounted on stolen horses, laughed at the pursuit of the regular cavalry sent to hunt them down, and whom they took pleasure to ambush most scientifically in the broken ground of their own fastness. Expeditions had been fitted out, a price had been put upon his head, even attempts had been made, treacherously of course, to open negotiations with him, without in the slightest way affecting the even tenor of his career. At last, in true Costaguana fashion, the fiscal of Tonoro, who was ambitious of the glory of having reduced the famous Hernandez, offered him a sum of money and a safe conduct out of the country for the betrayal of his band. But Hernandez evidently was not of the stuff of which the distinguished military politicians and conspirators of Costaguana are made. This clever but common device, which frequently works like a charm in putting down revolutions, failed with the chief of vulgar salteadores. It promised well for the fiscal at first, but ended very badly for the squadron of lanceros posted, by the fiscal's directions, in a fold of the ground into which Hernandez had promised to lead his unsuspecting followers. They came, indeed, at the appointed time, but creeping on their hands and knees through the bush, and only let their presence be known by a general discharge of firearms, which emptied many saddles. The troopers who escaped came riding very hard into Tonoro. It is said that their commanding officer, who, being better mounted, rode far ahead of the rest, afterwards got into a state of despairing intoxication and beat the ambitious fiscal severely with the flat of his sabre in the presence of his wife and daughters, for bringing this disgrace upon the national army. The highest civil official of Tonoro, falling to the ground in a swoon, was further kicked all over the body and rowelled with sharp spurs about the neck and face, because of the great sensitiveness of his military colleague. This gossip of the inland Campo, so characteristic of the rulers of the country, with its story of oppression, inefficiency, fatuous methods, treachery, and savage brutality, was perfectly known to Mrs. Gould. That it should be accepted with no indignant comment by people of intelligence, refinement, and character, as something inherent in the nature of things, was one of the symptoms of degradation that had the power to exasperate her almost to the verge of despair. Still, looking at the ingot of silver, she shook her head at Don Pepe's remark. "If it had not been for the lawless tyranny of your government, Don Pepe, many an outlaw now with Hernandez would be living peaceably and happy by the honest work of his hands." "Senora," cried Don Pepe with enthusiasm, "it is true. It is as if God had given you the power to look into the very breasts of people. You have seen them working around you, Dona Emilia, meek as lambs, patient like their own burros, brave like lions. I have led them to the very muzzles of guns. I, who stand here before you, Senora, in the time of Paez, who was full of generosity, and in courage only approached by the uncle of Don Carlos here, as far as I know. No wonder there are bandits in the Campo when there are none but thieves, swindlers, and sanguinary macaques to rule us in Santa Marta. However, all the same, a bandit is a bandit, and we shall have a dozen good straight Winchesters to ride with the silver down to Sulaco." Mrs. Gould's ride with the first silver escort to Sulaco was the closing episode of what she called "my camp life," before she settled in her town house permanently, as was proper and even necessary for the wife of the administrator of such an important institution as the San Tome mine. For the San Tome mine was to become an institution, a rallying point for everything in the province that needed order and stability to live. Security seemed to flow upon this land from the mountain gorge. The authorities of Sulaco had learned that the San Tome mine could make it worth their while to leave things and people alone. This was the nearest approach to the rule of common sense and justice Charles Gould felt it possible to secure at first. In fact, the mine, with its organization, its population growing fiercely attached to their position of privileged safety, with its armory, with its Don Pepe, with its armed body of serenos, where, it was said, many an outlaw and deserter, and even some members of Hernandez's band, had found a place. The mine was a power in the land, as a certain prominent man in Santa Marta had exclaimed with a hollow laugh once, when discussing the line of action taken by the Sulaco authorities at a time of political crisis. "You call these men government officials? They? Never! They are officials of the mine, officials of the concession, I tell you." The prominent man, who was then a person in power, with a lemon-colored face and a very short and curly, not to say woolly, head of hair, went so far in his temporary discontent as to shake his yellow fist under the nose of his interlocutor and shriek, "Yes! All! Silence! All! I tell you! The political jefe, the chief of the police, the chief of the customs, the general, all are the officials of that Gould." Thereupon an intrepid but low and argumentative murmur would flow on for a space in the ministerial cabinet, and the prominent man's passion would end in a cynical shrug of the shoulders. After all, he seemed to say, what did it matter as long as the minister himself was not forgotten during his brief day of authority? But all the same, the unofficial agent of the San Tome mine, working for a good cause, had his moments of anxiety, which were reflected in his letters to Don Jose Avellanos, his maternal uncle. "No sanguinary macaque from Santa Marta shall set foot on that part of Costaguana which lies beyond the San Tome bridge," Don Pepe used to assure Mrs. Gould, "except, of course, as an honored guest, for our Señor Administrator is a deep politico." But to Charles Gould, in his own room, the old major would remark with a grim and soldierly cheeriness, "We are all playing our heads at this game." Don Jose Avellanos would mutter, "Imperium in imperio, Emilia, my soul," with an air of profound self-satisfaction, which, somehow, in a curious way, seemed to contain a queer admixture of bodily discomfort, but that, perhaps, could only be visible to the initiated. And for the initiated it was a wonderful place, this drawing-room of the Casa Gould, with its momentary glimpses of the master, El Señor Administrator, older, harder, mysteriously silent, with the lines deepened on his English, ruddy, out-of-doors complexion, flitting on his thin cavalryman's legs across the doorways, either just back from the mountain, or with jingling spurs and riding whip under his arm on the point of starting for the mountain. Then Don Pepe, modestly martial in his chair, the llanero who seemed somehow to have found his martial jocularity, his knowledge of the world, and his manner perfect for his station, in the midst of savage armed contests with his kind. Avellanos, polished and familiar, the diplomatist with his loquacity covering much caution and wisdom in delicate advice, with his manuscript of a historical work on Costaguana, entitled 50 Years of Misrule, which, at present, he thought it was not prudent, if it were possible, to give to the world. These three, and also Dona Emilia among them, gracious, small, and fairy-like before the glittering tea-set, with one common master thought in their heads, with one common feeling of a tense situation, with one ever-present aim to preserve the inviolable character of the mine at every cost. And there was also to be seen Captain Mitchell, a little apart, near one of the long windows, with an air of old-fashioned, neat old bachelorhood about him, slightly pompous, in a white waistcoat, a little disregarded and unconscious of it, utterly in the dark, and imagining himself to be in the thick of things. The good man, having spent a clear 30 years of his life on the high seas before getting what he called a "shore billet," was astonished at the importance of transactions, other than related to shipping, which take place on dry land. Almost every event out of the usual daily course marked an epoch for him, or else was history, unless with his pomposity struggling with a discomfited droop of his rubicund, rather handsome face, set off by snow-white close hair and short whiskers, he would mutter, "Ah, that, sir, was a mistake." The reception at the first consignment of San Tome silver for shipment to San Francisco in one of the O.S.N. Company's mail boats had, of course, marked an epoch for Captain Mitchell. The ingots, packed in boxes of stiff oxhide with plated handles, small enough to be carried easily by 2 men, were brought down by the serenos of the mine, walking in careful couples along the half-mile or so of steep, zigzag paths to the foot of the mountain. There they would be loaded into a string of 2-wheeled carts, resembling roomy coffers with a door at the back, and harnessed tandem with 2 mules each, waiting under the guard of armed and mounted serenos. Don Pepe padlocked each door in succession, and at the signal of his whistle the string of carts would move off, closely surrounded by the clank of spur and carbine, with jolts and cracking of whips, with a sudden deep rumble over the boundary bridge. "Into the land of thieves and sanguinary macaques," Don Pepe defined that crossing. Hats bobbing in the first light of the dawn on the heads of cloaked figures. Winchesters on hip. Bridle hands protruding lean and brown from under the falling folds of the ponchos. The convoy skirting a little wood, along the mine trail, between the mud huts and low walls of Rincon, increased its pace on the Camino Real, mules urged to speed, escort galloping, Don Carlos riding alone ahead of a dust storm, affording a vague vision of long ears of mules, of fluttering little green and white flags stuck upon each cart, of raised arms in a mob of sombreros with the white gleam of ranging eyes, and Don Pepe, hardly visible in the rear of that rattling dust trail, with a stiff seat and impassive face, rising and falling rhythmically on an ewe-necked, silver-bitted black brute with a hammer head. The sleepy people in the little clusters of huts, in the small ranches near the road, recognized by the headlong sound the charge of the San Tome silver escort towards the crumbling wall of the city on the Campo side. They came to the doors to see it dash by over ruts and stones, with a clatter and clank and cracking of whips, with the reckless rush and precise driving of a field battery hurrying into action, and the solitary English figure of the Señor Administrador riding far ahead in the lead. In the fenced roadside paddocks loose horses galloped wildly for a while. The heavy cattle stood up breast deep in the grass, lowing mutteringly at the flying noise. A meek Indian villager would glance back once, and hasten to shove his loaded little donkey bodily against a wall, out of the way of the San Tome silver escort going to the sea. A small knot of Chile leperos under the stone horse of the Alameda would mutter "Caramba!" on seeing it take a wide curve at a gallop and dart into the empty street of the Constitution, for it was considered the correct thing, the only proper style by the mule drivers of the San Tome mine, to go through the waking town from end to end without a check in the speed, as if chased by a devil. The early sunshine glowed on the delicate primrose, pale pink, pale blue fronts of the big houses with all their gates shut yet, and no face behind the iron bars of the windows. In the whole sunlit range of empty balconies along the street, only one white figure would be visible high up above the clear pavement, the wife of the Senor Administrador, leaning over to see the escort go by to the harbor, a mass of heavy, fair hair twisted up negligently on her little head, and a lot of lace about the neck of her muslin wrapper. With a smile to her husband's single, quick, upward glance, she would watch the whole thing stream past below her feet with an orderly uproar, till she answered by a friendly sign the salute of the galloping Don Pepe, the stiff, deferential inclination with a sweep of the hat below the knee. The string of padlocked carts lengthened. The size of the escort grew bigger as the years went on. Every 3 months an increasing stream of treasure swept through the streets of Sulaco on its way to the strong room in the O.S.N. Company's building by the harbor, there to await shipment for the north, increasing in volume and of immense value also. For, as Charles Gould told his wife once with some exultation, there had never been seen anything in the world to approach the vein of the gold concession. For them both, each passing of the escort under the balconies of the Casa Gould was like another victory gained in the conquest of peace for Sulaco. End of Part 2, Chapter 8. Chapter 8 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Bologna Times. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part 3, Chapter 8. No doubt the initial action of Charles Gould had been helped at the beginning by a period of comparative peace which occurred just about that time, and also by the general softening of manners as compared with the epoch of civil wars whence had emerged the iron tyranny of Guzman Bento of fearful memory. In the contests that broke out at the end of his rule, which had kept peace in the country for a whole 15 years, there was more fatuous imbecility, plenty of cruelty and suffering still, but much less of the old-time fierce and blindly ferocious political fanaticism. It was all more vile, more base, more contemptible, and infinitely more manageable in the very outspoken cynicism of motives. It was more clearly a brazen-faced scramble for a constantly diminishing quantity of booty, since all enterprise had been stupidly killed in the land. Thus it came to pass that the province of Sulaco, once the field of cruel party vengeances, had become in a way one of the considerable prizes of political career. The great of the earth in Santa Marta reserved the posts in the old Occidental state to those nearest and dearest to them, nephews, brothers, husbands, or favorite sisters, bosom friends, trusty supporters, or prominent supporters of whom perhaps they were afraid. It was the blessed province of great opportunities and of largest salaries, for the San Tome mine had its own unofficial pay list, whose items and amounts, fixed in consultation by Charles Gould and Senor Avellanos, were known to a prominent business man in the United States, who for 20 minutes or so every month gave his undivided attention to Sulaco affairs. At the same time the material interests of all sorts, backed up by the influence of the San Tome mine, were quietly gathering substance in that part of the republic. If, for instance, the Sulaco collectorship was generally understood, in the political world of the capital, to open the way to the Ministry of Finance, and so on for every official post, then, on the other hand, the despondent business circles of the Republic had come to consider the Occidental Province as the promised land of safety, especially if a man managed to get on good terms with the administration of the mine. Charles Gould, excellent fellow, absolutely necessary to make sure of him before taking a single step. Get an introduction to him from Moraga if you can, the agent of the King of Sulaco, don't you know. No wonder, then, that Sir John, coming from Europe to smooth the path for his railway, had been meeting the name, and even the nickname, of Charles Gould at every turn in Costaguana. The agent of the San Tome administration in Santa Marta, a polished, well-informed gentleman, Sir John thought him, had certainly helped so greatly in bringing about the presidential tour that he began to think that there was something in the faint whispers hinting at the immense occult influence of the gold concession. What was currently whispered was this, that the San Tome administration had, in part at least, financed the last revolution, which had brought into a 5-year dictatorship Don Vicente Ribiera, a man of culture and of unblemished character, invested with a mandate of reform by the best elements of the state. Serious, well-informed men seemed to believe the fact, to hope for better things, for the establishment of legality, of good faith, and order in public life. So much the better, then, thought Sir John. He worked always on a great scale. There was a loan to the state, and a project for systematic colonization of the Occidental Province, involved in one vast scheme with the construction of the National Central Railway. Good faith, order, honesty, peace were badly wanted for this great development of material interests. Anybody on the side of these things, and especially if able to help, had an importance in Sir John's eyes. He had not been disappointed by the King of Sulaco. The local difficulties had fallen away, as the engineer-in-chief had foretold they would, before Charles Gould's mediation. Sir John had been extremely feted in Sulaco, next to the president dictator, a fact which might have accounted for the evident ill humor General Montero displayed at lunch given on board the Juno just before she was to sail, taking away from Sulaco the president dictator and the distinguished foreign guests in his train. The Excellentissimo, the hope of honest men, as Don Jose had addressed him in a public speech delivered in the name of the Provincial Assembly of Sulaco, sat at the head of the long table. Captain Mitchell, positively stony-eyed and purple in the face with the solemnity of this historical event, occupied the foot as the representative of the O.S.N. Company in Sulaco, the hosts of that informal function, with the captain of the ship and some minor officials from the shore around him. Those cheery, swarthy little gentlemen cast jovial side glances at the bottles of champagne beginning to pop behind the guests' backs in the hands of the ship's stewards. The amber wine creamed up to the rims of the glasses. Charles Gould had his place next to a foreign envoy, who, in a listless undertone, had been talking to him fitfully of hunting and shooting. The well-nourished, pale face, with an eyeglass and drooping yellow moustache, made the Señor Administrador appear by contrast twice as sun-baked, more flaming red, 100 times more intensely and silently alive. Don Jose Avellanos touched elbows with the other foreign diplomat, a dark man with a quiet, watchful, self-confident demeanor, and a touch of reserve. All etiquette being laid aside on the occasion, General Montero was the only one there in full uniform, so stiff with embroideries in front that his broad chest seemed protected by a cuirass of gold. Sir John, at the beginning, had got away from high places for the sake of sitting near Mrs. Gould. The great financier was trying to express to her his grateful sense of her hospitality, and of his obligation to her husband's enormous influence in this part of the country. when she interrupted him by a low "Hush!" The president was going to make an informal pronouncement. The Excellentissimo was on his legs. He said only a few words, evidently deeply felt, and meant perhaps mostly for Avellanos, his old friend, as to the necessity of unremitting effort to secure the lasting welfare of the country emerging after this last struggle, he hoped, into a period of peace and material prosperity. Mrs. Gould, listening to the mellow, slightly mournful voice, looking at this rotund, dark, spectacled face, at the short body, obese to the point of infirmity, thought that this man of delicate and melancholy mind, physically almost a cripple, coming out of his retirement into a dangerous strife at the call of his fellows, had the right to speak with the authority of his self-sacrifice. And yet she was made uneasy. He was more pathetic than promising, this first civilian chief of the state Costaguana had ever known, pronouncing, glass in hand, his simple watchwords of honesty, peace, respect for law, political good faith abroad and at home, the safeguards of national honor. He sat down. During the respectful, appreciative buzz of voices that followed the speech, General Montero raised a pair of heavy, drooping eyelids and rolled his eyes with a sort of uneasy dullness from face to face. The military backwoods hero of the party, though secretly impressed by the sudden novelties and splendors of his position, he had never been on board a ship before, and had hardly ever seen the sea except from a distance, understood by a sort of instinct the advantage his surly, unpolished attitude of a savage fighter gave him amongst all these refined Blanco aristocrats. But why was it that nobody was looking at him? He wondered to himself angrily. He was able to spell out the print of newspapers, and knew that he had performed the greatest military exploit of modern times. "My husband wanted the railway," Mrs. Gould said to Sir John in the general murmur of resumed conversations. "All this brings nearer the sort of future we desire for the country, which has waited for it in sorrow long enough, God knows. But I will confess that the other day, during my afternoon drive, when I suddenly saw an Indian boy ride out of a wood with a red flag of a surveying party in his hand, I felt something of a shock. The future means change, an utter change. And yet even here there are simple and picturesque things that one would like to preserve." Sir John listened, smiling, but it was his turn now to hush Mrs. Gould. "General Montero is going to speak," he whispered, and almost immediately added, in comic alarm, "Heavens! He's going to propose my own health, I believe." General Montero had risen with a jingle of steel scabbard and a ripple of glitter on his gold-embroidered breast. A heavy sword hilt appeared at his side above the edge of the table. In this gorgeous uniform, with his bull neck, his hooked nose flattened on the tip upon a blue-black dyed moustache, he looked like a disguised and sinister vaquero. The drone of his voice had a strangely rasping, soulless ring. He floundered, lowering, through a few vague sentences, then suddenly raising his big head and his voice together, burst out harshly: "The honor of the country is in the hands of the army. I assure you I shall be faithful to it." He hesitated till his roaming eyes met Sir John's face, upon which he fixed a lurid, sleepy glance, and the figure of the lately negotiated loan came into his mind. He lifted his glass. "I drink to the health of the man who brings us £1.5 million of pounds." He tossed off his champagne and sat down heavily, with a half surprised, half bullying look all round the faces in the profound, as if appalled, silence which succeeded the felicitous toast. Sir John did not move. "I don't think I am called upon to rise," he murmured to Mrs. Gould. "That sort of thing speaks for itself." But Don Jose Avellanos came to the rescue with a short oration, in which he alluded pointedly to England's goodwill towards Costaguana. "A goodwill," he continued, significantly, "of which I, having been in my time accredited to the court of St. James, am able to speak with some knowledge." Only then Sir John thought fit to respond, which he did gracefully in bad French, punctuated by bursts of applause and the "hear, hears" of Captain Mitchell, who was able to understand a word now and then. Directly he had done, the financier of railways turned to Mrs. Gould. "You were good enough to say that you intended to ask me for something," he reminded her, gallantly. "What is it? Be assured that any request from you would be considered in the light of a favour to myself." She thanked him by a gracious smile. Everybody was rising from the table. "Let us go on deck," she proposed, "where I'll be able to point out to you the very object of my request." An enormous national flag of Costaguana, diagonal red and yellow, with two green palm trees in the middle, floated lazily at the mainmast head of the Juno. A multitude of fireworks, being let off in their thousands at the water's edge in honour of the President, kept up a mysterious crepitating noise half round the harbour. Now and then a lot of rockets, swishing upwards invisibly, detonated overhead with only a puff of smoke in the bright sky. Crowds of people could be seen between the town gate and the harbour, under the bunches of multicoloured flags fluttering on tall poles. Faint bursts of military music would be heard suddenly, and the remote sound of shouting. A knot of ragged negroes at the end of the wharf kept on loading and firing a small iron cannon time after time. A greyish haze of dust hung thin and motionless against the sun. Don Vicente Ribiera made a few steps under the deck awning, leaning on the arm of Senor Avellanos. A wide circle was formed round him, where the mirthless smile of his dark lips and the sightless glitter of his spectacles could be seen turning amiably from side to side. The informal function, arranged on purpose on board the Juno to give the President Dictator an opportunity to meet intimately some of his most notable adherents in Sulaco, was drawing to an end. On one side General Montero, his bald head covered now by a plumed cocked hat, remained motionless on a skylight seat, a pair of big gauntleted hands folded on the hilt of the sabre standing upright between his legs. The white plume, the coppery tint of his broad face, the blue-black of the moustaches under the curved beak, the mass of gold on sleeves and breast, the high, shining boots with enormous spurs, the working nostrils, the imbecile and domineering stare of the glorious victor of Rio Seco had in them something ominous and incredible. The exaggeration of a cruel caricature, the fatuity of solemn masquerading, the atrocious grotesqueness of some military idol of Aztec conception and European bedecking, awaiting the homage of worshippers. Don Jose approached diplomatically this weird and inscrutable portent, and Mrs. Gould turned her fascinating eyes away at last. Charles, coming up to take leave of Sir John, heard him say, as he bent over his wife's hand, "Certainly. Of course, my dear Mrs. Gould, for a protégé of yours. Not the slightest difficulty. Consider it done." Going ashore in the same boat with the Goulds, Don Jose Avellanos was very silent. Even in the Gould carriage he did not open his lips for a long time. The mules trotted slowly away from the wharf, between the extended hands of the beggars, who for that day seemed to have abandoned in a body the portals of churches. Charles Gould sat on the back seat and looked away upon the plain. A multitude of booths made of green boughs, of rushes, of odd pieces of plank eked out with bits of canvas had been erected all over it, for the sale of cana, of dulces, of fruit, of cigars. Over little heaps of glowing charcoal, Indian women, squatting on mats, cooked food in black earthen pots, and boiled the water for the mate gourds, which they offered in soft, caressing voices to the country people. A race course had been staked out for the vaqueros, and away to the left, from where the crowd was massed thickly about a huge temporary erection, like a circus tent of wood, with a conical grass roof, came the resonant twanging of harp strings, the sharp ping of guitars, with the grave, drumming throb of an Indian gombo pulsating steadily through the shrill choruses of the dancers. Charles Gould said presently, "All this piece of land belongs now to the railway company. There will be no more popular feasts held here." Mrs. Gould was rather sorry to think so. She took this opportunity to mention how she had just obtained from Sir John the promise that the house occupied by Giorgio Viola should not be interfered with. She declared she could never understand why the survey engineers ever talked of demolishing that old building. It was not in the way of the projected harbor branch of the line in the least. She stopped the carriage before the door to reassure at once the old Genoese, who came out bareheaded and stood by the carriage step. She talked to him in Italian, of course, and he thanked her with calm dignity. An old Garibaldino was grateful to her from the bottom of his heart for keeping the roof over the heads of his wife and children. He was too old to wander any more. "And is it for ever, signora?" he asked. "For as long as you like." "Bene. Then the place must be named. It was not worth while before." He smiled ruggedly, with a running together of wrinkles at the corners of his eyes. "I shall set about the painting of the name to morrow." "And what is it going to be, Giorgio?" "Albergo d'Italia Una," said the old Garibaldino, looking away for a moment. "More in memory of those who have died," he added, "than for the country stolen from us soldiers of liberty by the craft of that accursed Piedmontese race of kings and ministers." Mrs. Gould smiled slightly, and, bending over a little, began to inquire about his wife and children. He had sent them into town on that day. The padrona was better in health. Many thanks to the signora for inquiring. People were passing in twos and threes, in whole parties of men and women attended by trotting children. A horseman, mounted on a silver gray mare, drew rein quietly in the shade of the house after taking off his hat to the party in the carriage, who returned smiles and familiar nods. Old Viola, evidently very pleased with the news he had just heard, interrupted himself for a moment to tell him rapidly that the house was secured, by the kindness of the English signora, for as long as he liked to keep it. The other listened attentively, but made no response. When the carriage moved on he took off his hat again, a gray sombrero with a silver cord and tassels. The bright colors of a Mexican serape twisted on the cantle, the enormous silver buttons on the embroidered leather jacket, the row of tiny silver buttons down the seam of the trousers, the snowy linen, a silk sash with embroidered ends, the silver plates on headstall and saddle, proclaimed the unapproachable style of the famous capataz de cargadores, a Mediterranean sailor, got up with more finished splendor than any well-to-do young ranchero of the Campo had ever displayed on a high holiday. "It is a great thing for me," murmured old Giorgio, still thinking of the house, for now he had grown weary of change. "The signora just said a word to the Englishman." "The old Englishman, who has enough money to pay for a railway? He is going off in an hour," remarked Nostromo, carelessly. "Buon viaggio, then. I've guarded his bones all the way from the Entrada Pass down to the plain and into Sulaco, as though he had been my own father." Old Giorgio only moved his head sideways, absently. Nostromo pointed after the Goulds' carriage, nearing the grass-grown gate in the old town wall that was like a wall of matted jungle. And I have sat alone at night with my revolver in the company's warehouse time and again by the side of that other Englishman's heap of silver, guarding it as though it had been my own." Viola seemed lost in thought. "It is a great thing for me," he repeated again, as if to himself. "It is," agreed the magnificent capataz de cargadores calmly. "Listen, Vecchio. Go in and bring me out a cigar, but don't look for it in my room. There's nothing there." Viola stepped into the cafe and came out directly, still absorbed in his idea, and tendered him a cigar, mumbling thoughtfully in his moustache. "Children growing up, and girls too, girls!" He sighed and fell silent. "What, only one?" remarked Nostromo, looking down with a sort of comic inquisitiveness at the unconscious old man. "No matter," he added, with lofty negligence. "One is enough till another is wanted." He lit it, and let the match drop from his passive fingers. Giorgio Viola looked up, and said abruptly, "My son would have been just such a fine young man as you, Gian' Battista, if he had lived." "What? Your son? But you are right, Padron. If he had been like me, he would have been a man." He turned his horse slowly and paced on between the booths, checking the mare almost to a standstill now and then for children, for the groups of people from the distant Campo, who stared after him with admiration. The company's lightermen saluted him from afar, and the greatly envied capataz de cargadores advanced, amongst murmurs of recognition and obsequious greetings, towards the huge circus-like erection. The throng thickened. The guitars tinkled louder. Other horsemen sat motionless, smoking calmly above the heads of the crowd. It eddied and pushed before the doors of the high-roofed building, whence issued a shuffle and thumping of feet in time to the dance music, vibrating and shrieking with a racking rhythm, overhung by a tremendous, sustained, hollow roar of the gombo, the barbarous and imposing noise of the big drum, that can madden a crowd and that even Europeans cannot hear without a strange emotion, seemed to draw Nostromo on to its source, while a man, wrapped up in a faded torn poncho, walked by his stirrup, and, buffeted right and left, begged "his worship" insistently for employment on the wharf. He whined, offering the Senor Capataz half his daily pay for the privilege of being admitted to the swaggering fraternity of cargadores. The other half would be enough for him, he protested. But Captain Mitchell's right-hand man, invaluable for our work, a perfectly incorruptible fellow, after looking down critically at the ragged mozo, shook his head without a word in the uproar going on around. The man fell back, and a little further on Nostromo had to pull up. From the doors of the dance hall men and women emerged, tottering, streaming with sweat, trembling in every limb, to lean, panting, with staring eyes and parted lips, against the wall of the structure, where the harps and guitars played on with mad speed in an incessant roll of thunder. Hundreds of hands clapped in there, voices shrieked, and then all at once would sink low, chanting in unison the refrain of a love song with a dying fall. A red flower, flung with a good aim from somewhere in the crowd, struck the resplendent capataz on the cheek. He caught it as it fell, neatly, but for some time did not turn his head. When at last he condescended to look round, the throng near him had parted to make way for a pretty morenita, her hair held up by a small golden comb, who was walking towards him in the open space. Her arms and neck emerged plump and bare from a snowy chemisette. The blue woolen skirt, with all the fullness gathered in front, scanty on the hips, and tight across the back, disclosed the provoking action of her walk. She came straight on and laid her hand on the mare's neck with a timid, coquettish look upwards out of the corner of her eyes. "Querido," she murmured caressingly, "why do you pretend not to see me when I pass?" "Because I don't love thee any more," said Nostromo, deliberately, after a moment of reflective silence. The hand on the mare's neck trembled suddenly. She dropped her head before all the eyes in the wide circle formed round the generous, the terrible, the inconstant capataz de cargadores and his morenita. Nostromo, looking down, saw tears beginning to fall down her face. "Has it come, then, ever beloved of my heart?" she whispered. "Is it true?" "No," said Nostromo, looking away carelessly. "It was a lie. I love thee as much as ever." "Is that true?" she cooed joyously, her cheeks still wet with tears. "It is true." "True on the life?" "As true as that; but thou must not ask me to swear it on the Madonna that stands in thy room." And the capataz laughed a little in response to the grins of the crowd. She pouted, very pretty, a little uneasy. "No, I will not ask for that." "I can see love in your eyes." She laid her hand on his knee. "Why are you trembling like this? For love?" she continued, while the cavernous thundering of the gombo went on without a pause. "But if you love her as much as that, you must give your Paquita a gold-mounted rosary of beads for the neck of her Madonna." "No," said Nostromo, looking into her uplifted, begging eyes, which suddenly turned stony with surprise. "No? Then what else will your worship give me on the day of the fiesta?" she asked angrily, "so as not to shame me before all these people." "There is no shame for thee in getting nothing from thy lover for once." "True; the shame is your worship's, my poor lover's," she flared up sarcastically. Laughs were heard at her anger, at her retort. What an audacious spitfire she was! The people aware of this scene were calling out urgently to others in the crowd. The circle round the silver grey mare narrowed slowly. The girl went off a pace or two, confronting the mocking curiosity of the eyes, then flung back to the stirrup, tiptoeing, her enraged face turned up to Nostromo with a pair of blazing eyes. He bent low to her in the saddle. "Juan!" she hissed. "I could stab thee to the heart." The dreaded capataz de cargadores, magnificent and carelessly public in his amours, flung his arm round her neck and kissed her spluttering lips. A murmur went round. "A knife!" he demanded at large, holding her firmly by the shoulder. 20 blades flashed out together in the circle. A young man in holiday attire, bounding in, thrust one in Nostromo's hand and bounded back into the ranks, very proud of himself. Nostromo had not even looked at him. "Stand on my foot," he commanded the girl, who, suddenly subdued, rose lightly, and when he had her up, encircling her waist, her face near to his, he pressed the knife into her little hand. "No, Morenita, you shall not put me to shame," he said. "You shall have your present. And so that everyone should know who is your lover to day, you may cut all the silver buttons off my coat." There were shouts of laughter and applause at this witty freak, while the girl passed the keen blade, and the impassive rider jingled in his palm the increasing hoard of silver buttons. He eased her to the ground with both her hands full. After whispering for a while with a very strenuous face, she walked away, staring haughtily, and vanished into the crowd. The circle had broken up, and the lordly capataz de cargadores, the indispensable man, the tried and trusty Nostromo, the Mediterranean sailor come ashore casually to try his luck in Costaguana, rowed slowly towards the harbour. The Juno was just then swinging round, and even as Nostromo reined up again to look on, a flag ran up on the improvised flagstaff erected in an ancient and dismantled little fort at the harbour entrance. Half a battery of field guns had been hurried over there from the Sulaco barracks for the purpose of firing the regulation salutes for the president dictator and the war minister. As the mailboat headed through the pass, the badly timed reports announced the end of Don Vincente Ribiera's first official visit to Sulaco, and for Captain Mitchell the end of another historic occasion. Next time when the hope of honest men was to come that way, a year and a half later, it was unofficially over the mountain tracks, fleeing after a defeat on a lame mule, to be only just saved by Nostromo from an ignominious death at the hands of a mob. It was a very different event, of which Captain Mitchell used to say, "It was history, history, sir, and that fellow of mine, Nostromo, you know, was right in it, absolutely making history, sir." But this event, creditable to Nostromo, was to lead immediately to another, which could not be classed either as history or as a mistake, in Captain Mitchell's phraseology. He had another word for it. "Sir," he used to say afterwards, "that was no mistake. It was a fatality, a misfortune pure and simple, sir. And that poor fellow of mine was right in it, right in the middle of it. A fatality, if ever there was one. And to my mind he has never been the same man since." End of Part 3, Chapter 8.
Part 2, Chapter 1 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mario Pineda. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part 2. The Isabels. Chapter 1. Through good and evil report in the varying fortune of that struggle which Don Jose had characterized in the phrase, "The fate of national honesty trembles in the balance," the Gould concession, Imperium in Imperio, had gone on working. The square mountain had gone on pouring its treasure down the wooden chutes to the unresting batteries of stamps. The lights of San Tome had twinkled night after night upon the great, limitless shadow of the Campo. Every 3 months the silver escort had gone down to the sea, as if neither the war nor its consequences could ever affect the ancient occidental state secluded beyond its high barrier of the Cordillera. All the fighting took place on the other side of that mighty wall of serrated peaks lorded over by the white dome of Higuerota, and as yet unbreached by the railway, of which only the first part, the easy Campo part from Sulaco of the Ibi Valley at the foot of the pass, had been laid. Neither did the telegraph line cross the mountains yet. Its poles, like slender beacons on the plain, penetrated into the forest fringe of the foothills cut by the deep avenue of the track, and its wire ended abruptly at the construction camp at a white deal table supporting a Morse apparatus in a long hut of planks with a corrugated iron roof overshadowed by gigantic cedar trees, the quarters of the engineer in charge of the advance section. The harbour was busy too, with the traffic in railway material and with the movements of troops along the coast. The O.S.N. Company found much occupation for its fleet. Costaguana had no navy, and, apart from a few Coast Guard cutters, there were no national ships except a couple of old merchant steamers used as transports. Captain Mitchell, feeling more and more in the thick of history, found time for an hour or so during an afternoon in the drawing room of the Casa Gould, where, with a strange ignorance of the real forces at work around him, he professed himself delighted to get away from the strain of affairs. He did not know what he would have done without his invaluable Nostromo, he declared. Those confounded Costaguana politics gave him more work, he confided to Mrs. Gould, than he had bargained for. Don Jose Avellanos had displayed in the service of the endangered Ribiera government an organizing activity and an eloquence of which the echoes reach over even Europe. For, after the new loan to the Riviera government, Europe had become interested in Costaguana. The sala of the Provincial Assembly in the municipal buildings of Sulaco, with its portraits of the liberators on the walls and an old flag of Cortes, preserved in a glass case above the president's chair, had heard all these speeches. The early one containing the impassioned declaration, "Militarism is the enemy," the famous one of the trembling balance, delivered on the occasion of the vote for the raising of the second Sulaco regiment in the defense of the reforming government, and when the provinces again displayed their own flags, proscribing Guzman Bento's time, there was another of those great orations when Don Jose greeted these old emblems of the War of Independence, brought out again in the name of new ideals. The old idea of federalism had disappeared. For his part, he did not wish to revive old political doctrines. They were perishable. They died. But the doctrine of political rectitude was immortal. The second Sulaco regiment, to whom he was presenting this flag, was going to show its valour in a contest for order, peace, progress, for the establishment of national self-respect without which, he declared with energy, we are a reproach and a byword amongst the powers of the world. Don Jose Avellanos loved his country. He had served it lavishly with his fortune during his diplomatic career, and the later story of his captivity and barbarous ill usage under Guzman Bento was well known to his listeners. It was a wonder that he had not been a victim of the ferocious and summary executions which marked the course of that tyranny. For Guzman had ruled the country with the sombre imbecility of political fanaticism. The power of supreme government had become in his dull mind an object of strange worship, as if it were some sort of cruel deity. It was incarnated in himself, and in his adversaries, the Federalists, were the supreme sinners, objects of hate, abhorrence, and fear, as heretics would be to a convinced inquisitor. For years he had carried about at the tail of the army of pacification all over the country a captive band of such atrocious criminals who considered themselves most unfortunate at not having been summarily executed. It was a diminishing company of nearly naked skeletons, loaded with irons, covered with dirt, with vermin, with raw wounds, all men of position, of education, of wealth, who had learned to fight amongst themselves for scraps of rotten beef thrown to them by soldiers, or to beg a negro cook for a drink of muddy water in pitiful accents. Don Jose Avellanos, clanking his chains amongst the others, seemed only to exist in order to prove how much hunger, pain, degradation, and cruel torture a human body can stand without parting with the last spark of life. Sometimes interrogatories, backed by some primitive method of torture, were administered to them by a commission of officers hastily assembled in a hut of sticks and branches, and made pitiless by the fear for their own lives. A lucky one or two of that spectral company of prisoners would perhaps be led tottering behind a bush to be shot by a file of soldiers. Always an army chaplain, some unshaven, dirty man, girt with a sword, and with a tiny cross embroidered in white cotton on the left breast of a lieutenant's uniform, would follow, cigarette in the corner of the mouth, wooden stool in hand, to hear the confession and give an absolution. For the citizen saviour of the country, Guzman Bento was called thus officially in petitions, was not averse from the exercise of rational clemency. The irregular report of the firing squad would be heard, followed sometimes by a single finishing shot. A little bluish cloud of smoke would float up above the green bushes, and the army of pacification would move on over the savannas, through the forests, crossing rivers, invading rural pueblos, devastating the haciendas of the horrid aristocrats, occupying the inland towns in the fulfillment of its patriotic mission, and leaving behind a united land wherein the evil taint of federalism could no longer be detected in the smoke of burning houses and the smell of spilt blood. Don Jose Avellanos had survived that time. Perhaps, when contemptuously signifying to him his release, The citizen savior of the country might have thought this benighted aristocrat too broken in health and spirit and fortune to be any longer dangerous. Or, perhaps, it might have been a simple caprice. Guzman Bento, usually full of fanciful fears and brooding suspicions, had sudden access of unreasonable self-confidence when he perceived himself elevated on a pinnacle of power and safety beyond the reach of mere mortal plotters. At such times he would impulsively command the celebration of a solemn mass of thanksgiving, which would be sung in great pomp in the Cathedral of Santa Marta by the trembling, subservient archbishop of his creation. He heard it sitting in a gilt armchair placed before the high altar, surrounded by the civil and military heads of his government. The unofficial world of Santa Marta would crowd into the cathedral, for it was not quite safe for anybody of mark to stay away from these manifestations of presidential piety. Having thus acknowledged the only power he was at all disposed to recognize as above himself, he would scatter acts of political grace in a sardonic wantonness of clemency. There was no other way left now to enjoy his power but by seeing his crushed adversaries crawl impotently into the light of day out of the dark, noisome cells of the Collegio. Their harmlessness fed his insatiable vanity, and they could always be got hold of again. It was the rule for all the women of their families to present things afterwards in a special audience. The incarnation of that strange god, El Gobierno Supremo, received them standing, cocked hat on head, and exhorted them in a menacing mutter to show their gratitude by bringing up their children in fidelity to the democratic form of government, which I have established for the happiness of our country. His front teeth having been knocked out in some accident of his former herdsman's life, his utterance was spluttering and indistinct. He had been working for Costaguana along in the midst of treachery and opposition. Let it cease now, lest he should become weary of forgiving. Don Jose Avellanos had known this forgiveness. He was broken in health and fortune, deplorably enough to present a truly gratifying spectacle to the supreme chief of democratic institutions. He retired to Sulaco. His wife had an estate in that province, and she nursed him back to life out of the house of death and captivity. When she died, their daughter, an only child, was old enough to devote herself to poor papa. Miss Avellanos, born in Europe and educated partly in England, was a tall, grave girl with a self-possessed manner, a wide forehead, a wealth of rich brown hair, and blue eyes. The other young ladies of Sulaco stood in awe of her character and accomplishments. She was reputed to be terribly learned and serious. As to pride, it was well known that all the Corbellans were proud, and her mother was a Corbellan. Don Jose Avellanos depended very much upon the devotion of his beloved Antonia. He accepted it in the benighted way of men, who, made in God's image, are like stone idols without sense before the smoke of certain burnt offerings. He was ruined in every way, but a man possessed of passion is not a bankrupt in life. Don Jose Avellanos desired passionately for his country, peace, prosperity, and, as the end of the preface to 50 Years of Misrule has it, an honorable place in the committee of civilized nations. In this last phrase, the minister plenipotentiary, cruelly humiliated by the bad faith of his government towards the foreign bondholders, stands disclosed in the Patriot. The fatuous turmoil of greedy factions succeeding the tyranny of Guzman Bento seemed to bring his desire to the very door of opportunity. He was too old to descend personally into the centre of the arena at Santa Marta, but the men who acted there sought his advice at every step. He himself thought that he could be most useful at a distance in Sulaco. His name, his connections, his former position, his experience commanded the respect of his class. The discovery that this man, living in dignified poverty in the Corbellan town residence opposite the Casa Gould, could dispose of material means towards the support of the coast, increased his influence. It was his open letter of appeal that decided the candidature of Don Vicente Ribiera for the presidency. Another of these informal state papers drawn up by Don Jose, this time in the shape of an address from the province, induced that scrupulous constitutionalist to accept the extraordinary powers conferred upon him for 5 years by an overwhelming vote of Congress in Santa Marta. It was a specific mandate to establish the prosperity of the people on the basis of firm peace at home and to redeem the national credit by the satisfaction of all just claims abroad. On the afternoon, the news of that vote had reached Sulaco by the usual roundabout postal way, through Caita, and up the coast by steamer. Don Jose, who had been waiting for the mail in the Gould's drawing room, got out of the rocking chair, letting his hat fall off his knees. He rubbed his silvery, short hair with both hands, speechless with excess of joy. "Emilia, my soul," he had burst out, "let me embrace you. Let me—" Captain Michel, had he been there, would no doubt have made an apt remark about the dawn of a new era. But Don Jose thought something of the kind. His eloquence failed him on this occasion. The inspirer of that revival of the Blanco party tottered where he stood. Mrs. Gould moved forward quickly, and, as she offered her cheek with a smile to her old friend, managed very cleverly to give him the support of her arm he really needed. Don Jose had recovered himself at once, but for a time he could do nothing than murmur, "Oh, you two patriots! Oh, you two patriots!" looking from one to the other. Vague plans of another historical work, wherein all the devotions to the regeneration of the country he loved would be enshrined for the reverent worship of posterity, flitted through his mind. The historian who had enough elevation of soul to write of Guzman Bento, yet this monster, imbued in the blood of his countrymen, must not be held unreservedly to the execration of future years. It appears to be true that he, too, loved his country. He had given it 12 years of peace, and absolute master of lives and fortunes as he was, he died poor. His worst fault, perhaps, was not his ferocity, but his ignorance. The man who could write thus of a cruel persecutor, the passage occurs in his History of Misrule, felt at the foreshadowing of success an almost boundless affection for his two helpers, for these two young people from over the sea. Just as years ago, calmly, from the conviction of practical necessity, stronger than any abstract political doctrine, Henry Gould had drawn the sword, so now, the times being changed, Charles Gould had flung the silver of the Saint Thome into the fray. The English of Sulaco, the Costaguana Englishman of the third generation, was as far from being a political intriguer as his uncle from a revolutionary swashbuckler. Springing from the instinctive uprightness of their natures, their action was reasoned. They saw an opportunity and used the weapon to hand. Charles Gould's position, a commanding position, in the background of that attempt to retrieve the peace and the credit of the Republic, was very clear. At the beginning, he had had to accommodate himself to existing circumstances of corruption so naively brazen as to disarm the hate of a man courageous enough not to be afraid of its irresponsible potency to ruin everything it touched. It seemed to him too contemptible for hot anger even. He made use of it with a cold, fearless scorn, manifested rather than concealed by the forms of stony courtesy, which did away with much of the ignominy of the situation. At bottom, perhaps, he suffered from it, for he was not a man of cowardly illusions, but he refused to discuss the ethical view with his wife. He trusted that, though a little disenchanted, she would be intelligent enough to understand that this character safeguarded the enterprise of their lives as much or more than his policy. The extraordinary development of the mine had put a great power into his hands. To feel that prosperity always at the mercy of intelligent greed had grown irksome to him. To Mrs. Gould it was humiliating. At any rate, it was dangerous. In the confidential communications passing between Charles Gould, the kingdom of Sulaco, and the head of the silver and steel interests far away in California, the convictions were growing that any attempt made by men of education and integrity ought to be discreetly supported. You might tell your friend Avellanos that I think so, Mr. Holroyd had written at the proper moment from his inviolable sanctuary within the 11-story high factory of great affairs. And shortly afterwards, with the credit opened by the Third Southern Bank, located next door but one to the Holroyd building, the Ribierist party in Costaguana took a practical shape under the eye of the administrator of the San Tome mine. And Don Jose, the hereditary friend of the Gould family, could say, "Perhaps, my dear Carlos, I shall not have believed in vain." End of part 2, chapter 1. Second chapter 2 of Nostromo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mario Pineda. Nostromo by Joseph Conrad. Part 2, The Isabels. Chapter 2. After another armed struggle, decided by Montero's victory of Rio Seco, had been added to the tale of civil wars, the honest men, as Don Jose called them, could breathe freely for the first time in half a century. The 5-year mandate law became the basis of that regeneration, the passionate desire and hope for which had been like the elixir of everlasting youth for Don Jose Avellanos. And when he was suddenly, and not quite unexpectedly, endangered by that brute Montero, it was a passionate indignation that gave him a new lease of life, as it were. Already, at the time of the president-dictator's visit to Sulaco, Moraga had sounded a note of warning from Santa Marta about the war minister. Montero and his brother made the subject of an earnest talk between the dictator-president and the Nestor-inspirer of the party. But Don Vicente, a doctor of philosophy from the Córdoba University, seemed to have an exaggerated respect for military ability, whose mysteriousness, since it appeared to be altogether independent of intellect, imposed upon his imagination. The victor of Rio Seco was a popular hero. His services were so recent that the president-dictator quailed before the obvious charge of political ingratitude. Great regenerating transactions were being initiated: the fresh loan, a new railway line, a vast colonization scheme. Anything that could unsettle the public opinion in the capital was to be avoided. Don Jose bowed to these arguments and tried to dismiss from his mind the gold-laced portent in boots, and with a sabre, made meaningless now at last, he hopped in the new order of things. Less than 6 months after the president-dictator's visit, Sulaco learned with stupefaction of the military revolt in the name of national honor. The Minister of War, in a barrack square allocution to the officers of the artillery regiment he had been inspecting, had declared the national honor sold to foreigners. The dictator, by his weak compliance with the demands of the European powers for the settlement of long outstanding money claims, had showed himself unfit to rule. A letter from Moraga explained afterwards that the initiative and even the very text of the incendiary allocution came, in reality, from the other Montero, the ex-guerrillero, the comandante de plaza. The energetic treatment of Dr. Monicam, sent for in haste to the mountain, who came galloping 3 leagues in the dark, saved Don Jose from a dangerous attack of jaundice. After getting over the shock, Don Jose refused to let himself be prostrated. Indeed, better news succeeded at first. The revolt in the capital had been suppressed after a night of fighting in the streets. Unfortunately, both the Monteros had been able to make their escape south, to their native province of Entre Montes. The hero of the forest march, the victor of Rio Seco, had been received with frenzied acclamation in Nicoya, the provincial capital. The troops in garrison there had gone to him in a body. The brothers were organizing an army, gathering malcontents, sending emissaries primed with patriotic lies to the people, and with promises of plunder to the wild llaneros. Even a Monterist press had come into existence, speaking oracularly of the secret promises of support given by our great sister republic of the north against the sinister land-grabbing designs of European powers, cursing in every issue the miserable Ribiera, who had plotted to deliver his country, bound hand and foot, for a prey to foreign speculators. Sulaco, pastoral and sleepy, with its opulent campo and the rich silver mine, heard the din of arms fitfully in its fortunate isolation. It was nevertheless in the very forefront of the defense with men and money, but the very rumors reached it circuitously from abroad even, so much was it cut off from the rest of the republic, not only by natural obstacles but also by the vicissitudes of the war. The Monteristos were besieging Cayta, an important postal link. The overland couriers ceased to come across the mountains, and no muleteer would consent to risk the journey at last. Even Bonifacio, on one occasion, failed to return from Santa Marta, either not daring to start, or perhaps captured by the parties of the enemy raiding the country between the Cordillera and the capital. Monterist publications, however, found their way into the province, mysteriously enough. And also Monterist emissaries preaching death to aristocrats in the villages and towns of the Campo. Very early at the beginning of the trouble, Hernandez, the bandit, had proposed, through the agency of an old priest of a village in the wilds, to deliver 2 of them to the Ribierist authorities in Tororo. They had come to offer him a free pardon and the rank of colonel from General Montero, in consideration of joining the rebel army with his mounted band. No notice was taken at the time of the proposal. It was joined, as an evidence of good faith, to a petition praying the Sulaco assembly for permission to enlist with all his followers in the forces being then raised in Sulaco for the defense of the 5-year mandate of regeneration. The petition, like everything else, had found its way into Don Jose's hands. He had showed to Mr. Gould these pages of dirty greyish rough paper, perhaps looted in some village store, covered with the crabbed, illiterate handwriting of the old padre, carried off from his hut by the side of a mud-walled church to be the secretary of the dreaded Salteador. They had both bent in the lamplight of the Gould drawing-room over the document containing the fierce and yet humble appeal of the man against the blind and stupid barbarity turning an honest ranchero into a bandit. A postscript of the priest stated that, but for being deprived of his liberty for 10 days, he had been treated with humanity and the respect due to his sacred calling. He had been, it appears, confessing and absolving the chief and most of the band, and he guaranteed the sincerity of their good disposition. He had distributed heavy penances, no doubt in the way of litanies and fasts, but he argued surely that it would be difficult for them to make their peace with God durably till they had made peace with man. Never before, perhaps, had Hernandez's head been in less jeopardy than when he petitioned humbly for permission to buy a pardon for himself and his gang of deserters by armed service. He could range afar from the wastelands, protecting his nest unchecked, because there were no troops left in the whole province. The usual garrison of Sulaco had gone south to the war, with its brass band playing the Bolivar March on the bridge of one of the OSN Company's steamers. The great family coaches drawn up along the shore of the harbor were made to rock on the high Lardern springs by the enthusiasm of the senoras and the senoritas standing up to wave their lace handkerchiefs as lighter after lighter packed full of troops left the end of the jetty. Nostromo directed the embarkation, under the superintendence of Captain Michel, red-faced in the sun, conspicuous in a white waistcoat, representing the allied and anxious goodwill of all the material interests of civilization. General Barrios, who commanded the troops, assured Don Jose on parting that in 3 weeks he would have Montero in a wooden cage drawn by 3 pair of oxen, ready for a tour through all the towns of the Republic. And then, Senora, he continued, baring his curly iron-grey head to Mrs. Gould in her landau, and then, Senora, we shall convert our swords into plowshares and grow rich. Even I myself, as soon as this little business is settled, shall open a fundacion on some land I have on the llanos, and to try to make a little money in peace and quietness. Senora, you know, old Costaguana knows, what do I say? This whole South American continent knows that Pablo Barrios has had his fill of military glory. Charles Gould was not present at the anxious and patriotic send-off. It was not his part to see the soldiers embark. It was neither his part, nor his inclination, nor his policy. His part, his inclination, and his policy were united in one endeavor to keep unchecked the flow of treasure he had started single-handed from the reopened scar in the flag on the mountain. As the mine developed, he had trained for himself some native help. There were foremen, artificers, and clerks, with Don Pepe for the gobernador of the mining population. For the rest, his shoulders alone sustained the whole weight of the imperium in imperio, the great gold concession whose mere shadow had been enough to crush the life out of his father. Mrs. Gould had no silver mine to look after. In the general life of the Gould concession she was represented by her 2 lieutenants, the doctor and the priest, but she fed her woman's love of excitement on events whose significance was purified to her by the fire of her imaginative purpose. On that day she had brought the Avellanos, father and daughter, down to the harbour with her. Amongst his other activities of that stirring time, Don Jose had become the chairman of a patriotic committee which had armed a great proportion of troops in the Sulaco command with an improved model of a military rifle. It had been just discarded for something still more deadly by one of the great European powers. How much of the market price for second-hand weapons was covered by the voluntary contributions of the principal families, and how much came from those funds Don Jose was understood to command abroad, remained a secret which he alone could have disclosed. But the ricos, as the populace called them, had contributed under the pressure of their Nestor's eloquence. Some of the more enthusiastic ladies had been moved to bring offerings of jewels into the hands of the man who was the life and soul of the party. There were moments when both his life and his soul seemed overtaxed by so many years of undiscouraged belief and regeneration. He appeared almost inanimate, sitting rigidly by the side of Mrs. Gould in the landau, with his fine old clean-shaven face of a uniform tint, as if modelled in yellow wax, shaded by a soft felt hat, the dark eyes looking out fixedly. Antonia, the beautiful Antonia, as Miss Avellanos was called in Sulaco, leaned back, facing them, and her full figure, the grave oval of her face with full red lips, made her look more mature than Mrs. Gould, with her mobile expression and small, erect person under a slightly swaying sunshade. Whenever possible, Antonia attended her father. Her recognized devotion witnessed the shocking effect of her scorn for the rigid conventions regulating the life of Spanish-American girlhood. And, in truth, she was no longer girlish. It was said that she often wrote state papers from her father's dictation and was allowed to read all the books in his library. At the receptions, where the situation was saved by the presence of a very decrepit old lady, a relation of the Corbellans, quite deaf and motionless in an armchair, Antonia could hold her own in a discussion with 2 or 3 men at a time. Obviously she was not the girl to be content with peeping through a barred window at the cloaked figure of a lover ensconced in a doorway opposite, which is the correct form of Costaguana courtship. It was generally believed that with her foreign upbringing and foreign ideas, the learned and proud Antonia would never marry, unless, indeed, she married a foreigner from Europe or North America, now that Sulaco seemed on the point of being invaded by all the world. End of part 2, chapter